The panic has clearly already begun at the center of the Cuban dictatorship because Trump put Cuba under pressure on two fronts. Meanwhile, the aircraft carrier USS Nimitz appeared in the Caribbean as part of the pressure campaign against Cuba, just as Trump targets the old core of the dictatorship and turns the Castro case into a brutal warning for Havana. On May 21st, 2026, the United States Southern Command announced the arrival of the Nimitz strike group in the region, with ships, aircraft, and enough naval force to leave any regime cornered. The indictment against Raul Castro is already weighing heavily, but what increases the fear in Cuba is seeing Washington moving real military power to the area around the island at the same time that the US justice system is taking the last Castro out of his comfort zone. Havana may repeat its resistance rhetoric, but an American aircraft carrier in the Caribbean does not go unnoticed by a dictatorship. A broken dictatorship without electricity, without food, and without any moral standing before its own people. If Trump has already put the Nimitz on the board and even opened a legal case against Castro, what will be the next step against the Cuban regime? Can Havana still pretend everything is normal? If the Cuban dictatorship is already experiencing blackouts, hunger, and internal fear, what happens in this final gasp of the regime while the Cuban people have waited 67 years for this moment? I'll tell you all about that in a moment. But right now, you'll want to subscribe to the channel to stay well informed. Real-time information with the best journalistic quality you've ever seen. Milson Alves Global, the standard of credibility. The United States Department of Justice broke the silence and announced charges against Raul Modesto Castro Ruz, now 94 years old, for conspiracy to kill American citizens, 4 counts of homicide, and 2 charges related to the destruction of aircraft. 2 aircraft were hit in international airspace without warning, and all occupants died. For the White House, this turns the case into a crime against United States citizens, and not just a political dispute with Havana. The aircraft carrier in the Caribbean adds weight to the warning. Officially, the SS Nimitz is taking part in the Southern Seas 2026 mission conducted by the United States 4th Fleet to expand cooperative maritime operations, training, and regional security. But the presence of a strike group of this size in the midst of Raul Castro's indictment changes the political calculus in Havana. The Nimitz is not an ordinary ship. It is a platform for air power projection, command, surveillance, and military presence. When it appears in the Caribbean, on the same day that Washington targets the most symbolic name of the Cuban dictatorship, the regime understands that the pressure has moved beyond words and taken concrete form at sea. Trump treated the case as a major moment for Cuba and for the Cubans who left the island. He said that the Cuban nation is bankrupt, without food, without enough energy, and unable to survive under its own regime. At the same time, he denied that a military escalation is necessary right now. This response is calculated. Trump doesn't need to announce an invasion to scare Havana. He lets the Department of Justice act, keeps the Navy visible in the Caribbean, and pushes the dictatorship into an uncomfortable position. Either it pretends everything is normal while the last Castro becomes a legal target, or it admits that American pressure has reached the regime's most sensitive point. Miguel Diaz-Canel reacted by accusing Washington of a political maneuver and an attempt to fabricate a pretext for aggression against Cuba. The response came in the familiar tone of the dictatorship, blaming the United States, talking about sovereignty, and trying to turn a criminal accusation into an attack against the entire island. But Havana's problem is that the case didn't start now. The downing of the civilian aircraft in 1996 left a mark on the Cuban exile community and on the families of the victims. The regime tries to call the planes a threat, but the American accusation maintains that they were unarmed civilian aircraft from the exile community, shot down by military fighter jets with air-to-air missiles. The Cuban regime is also facing an internal crisis that makes this pressure even more dangerous. The island is experiencing blackouts, food shortages, lack of medicine, and mounting public frustration. That's where Marco Rubio's message hits hard. Rubio pointed out that the lack of electricity, food, and fuel cannot be blamed solely on external factors because the regime's elite controlled billions while the population endured long lines, blackouts, and poverty. This line directly targets the center of Cuban power, especially the economic structure linked to the military, hotels, state-owned companies, and the circle formed around the Castro family. Raul Castro no longer formally governs as before, but he remains the living symbol of the old guard. That's why the indictment has a greater political effect than the process itself. The Cuban dictatorship has always sold the idea that its leaders were untouchable. Now Raul's name appears in a federal indictment in the United States, with crimes that could lead to the maximum sentence if there is a conviction. The Department of Justice also mentioned Luis Raul Gonzalez Pardo Rodriguez, who is already in American custody for making false statements on an immigration document as one of the defendants in the case. This creates a concrete opening. It's not just a symbolic accusation. There is already at least one person involved who is directly within the reach of the American courts. For Havana, this is the worst-case scenario. The accusation wasn't tucked away in a cold courtroom. It came in a public political act charged with memory. Now the question weighing on Cuba is, what happens next? Trump says he doesn't see a need for immediate escalation, but he also doesn't rule out the next steps. The Department of Justice has already made Raul Castro and the others criminal defendants. The Southern Command maintains a naval presence in Havana. The Cuban government reacts with fury, but without offering a real solution for the population. The dictatorship tries to sell an image of resistance, while Washington increases the political cost of protecting a man accused of participating in an action that killed 4 people aboard civilian aircraft. The next move could come through the courts, diplomacy, or more economic and military pressure in the Caribbean. The immediate effect is already evident. Havana was forced to respond. Diaz-Canel came out in defense of Raul, and the regime began to treat a formal charge as an existential threat. The pressure also targets those who still support the regime from within. Generals, economic operators, figures connected to security, and political heirs of the Castro family are now looking at the case with a different kind of concern. If an episode from almost 30 years ago has come back forcefully now, other files may also be pulled from the archives. This is the part that will cause the outburst. The Cuban government the dictatorship survived for decades by counting on being forgotten, but Trump turned memory into an instrument of pressure. Cuba enters this new phase with a nervous regime, a tired population, and Washington talking about justice for the victims. The aircraft carrier in the Caribbean signals a presence, the indictment in Miami shows legal reach, and Trump's speech shows political direction. And the uncomfortable silence. The uncomfortable silence behind Cuban propaganda shows that Raul Castro, even in old age and away from the public eye, has become a central figure in a crisis that could open new chapters against the structure that rules the island. I'm Milson Alves, global internationalist, and my purpose is to keep you truthfully informed every day. The news links are in the video description. Leave a like on this video, subscribe to the channel, and at the end check out the comments so you can be even more engaged. Take care, see you next time.